Today we have a very special guest here in our studio. Mr. Alan Cantos, Director of Comité de Apoyo al Tibet, is a Spanish oceanographer who had been working with Dr. José Elias Esteve, a professor of international law at the University of Valencia. Both of them had been tirelessly pursuing 2 lawsuits against Chinese leaders and seeking justice for Tibetans using the principle of universal jurisdiction in international law. The decade-long lawsuits took a groundbreaking turn, making headline news last year when the Spanish High Court ruled indicting China's former president Hu Jintao on charges including crimes against humanity and genocide of Tibetan people, and when after a few months' delay, the court issued orders to Interpol for the detention of former Chinese President Jiang Zemin and 4 other Chinese leaders for their policies on Tibet. Earlier this year, the Spanish Parliament, following pressure from China, voted to move ahead with a bill limiting the power of the judiciary to investigate human rights abuses committed outside the country. We have invited Mr. Allen to our studio and will talk to him about universal jurisdiction in general and his future plans to reverse this law. Welcome to our show.
Welcome. Thank you.
So how have you been?
Very good, and ready to try to explain your questions.
Yeah. So my first question is, like, for the general public and for our listeners, could you explain what is universal jurisdiction in very, short and simple terms?
Yeah, well, universal jurisdiction is part of international law. It's not something invented in Spain. It's an old judicial procedure to be able to prosecute the most serious international crimes from national courts when justice cannot be made in the country in which they were committed. It stems from the Nuremberg trials after the genocide, the Nazi genocide. That's where the origin of universal jurisdiction. And it tries to fight impunity when in certain countries you cannot find justice.
Well, you have worked, your whole life, pursuing this law, and earlier this year, the Spanish Parliament has moved to overturn this law. So what impact that had, on the Spanish democratic principle and the European other nations, who hold the, democratic principles in high esteem?
Well, the impact has been very great and shocking, because following the very important ruling of the indictment of Hu Jintao and the orders of international arrest of the other 5 defendants, the Spanish government submitted to the desires of China in a most blatant and shameful way, and proceeded with the absolute majority in Parliament to reform the law of universal jurisdiction in order to cut our case and other cases that were uncomfortable to the big powers like China and others. And this has finally shocked Spanish society, because it was a blatant submission, and it should not create a precedent, because it means that China is beginning to rule our democracies, because one of the pillars of a healthy democracy is the separation of powers between the judicial power and the executive power. If another country comes and tells us what to do, and we as a modern democracy start breaking the independence of our judicial system, we have a big problem. And the Spanish press, the Spanish people, and the lawyers and Spanish judges are under big shock and rebellion against this way of following the orders of China. We just simply cannot do that and shouldn't do that. And this is the new legal fight that we are pursuing. We went from fighting in court for the truth of Tibet against the Chinese, and now we are fighting our own government for submitting to China and trying to change a very important law.
Mm-hmm. So it was very shocking for the Spanish people, but from the media angle, how did they take it?
Well, Spain has you know, big crisis, economic crisis, and big unemployment. So you know how the media is. Sometimes things don't get through, only get through the things that are more typical or more hyped up. But the difference here is not that because of what we achieved, which was like the truth being heard about the crimes being committed and the defendants being pointed and actually being sought for international arrest, and the fact that it affected other cases of universal jurisdiction in Spain, that has made the media react quite strongly, and El País and other main newspapers are publishing everything that is happening because it affects Tibet and other cases. And we should take this opportunity to show this new truth of shame, of submission to China, of a modern and healthy democracy like Spain is supposed to be.
So this law, you know, did it have any impact or effect on previous cases like this?
Yeah, it is affecting the case of genocide of the Mayan people in Guatemala. It is affecting the Guantanamo case, war crimes against, because of the shooting of a journalist in Baghdad by American military forces, and other uncomfortable cases that nevertheless are legal cases in international law, and you know, they are cases that are part of the judiciary and that should not be intervened by the political powers, like piracy, drug trafficking, serial killers. All this, every state admits that they can be arrested wherever they're found in order to avoid impunity. This is exactly the same, but because it affects politicians and states, they use this power as an excuse to make it look as if it's different. But everyone understands international piracy, drug trafficking, and no one complains. But the minute that you talk about crimes like torture, racial discrimination, genocide, or crimes against humanity, everyone reacts as if it was unacceptable or interference in a state's independence. And it's not like that. It is clearly stated in international law, which is a complete requirement for a new or old democracy.
Okay. So you had been pursuing this lawsuit for many, many years in the Spanish court. So did you get any help from the Tibetan public in general?
Well, this is a complicated case that needs the special the special energy and expertise of international lawyers like my friend and colleague and brother Jose. I mean, he's the one that really put the rigor, the legal and academic rigor and historical rigor in the legal status of Tibet and international law and what the Chinese had perpetrated there. We have fought this fight with different levels of support. It hasn't been as big as we would have wished, but then again, people sometimes don't understand the process of international law. They think it's something that is invented by Spain, and it's not like that. I mean, most countries can exercise international law and universal jurisdiction. You just need the will of lawyers and of the Tibetan community to find the right crimes and the right things to denounce.
Okay, now in very short, my last question, in your recent talk at the ICT, you talked about reversing this law. So how are you going to do it? Very short.
Okay, the Spanish courts have temporarily closed the case because of this submission and the law reform, but we are appealing. The plenary court that closed the case was not in total agreement. There was 7-9. So there was complete disagreement, and there were some discrepant or dissenting votes in the ruling, which showed that the ruling was bordering on illicit, even though one has to respect the sentence. It was by a very narrow margin, and there is many judges that are questioning it. So we are going to question it at the Constitutional Court and at the Supreme Court. So there is still hope for the case that can be reopened.
So, Mr. Alan, thank you very much for coming on our
Thank
show.
you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Alan Cantos is the director of Comité de Apoyo al Tibet, who has been working tirelessly pursuing 2 lawsuits against Chinese leaders and seeking justice for Tibetans using the principle of universal jurisdiction in the international law. Thank you for listening.